Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel, and this is an overview of prioritization of standards for Fremont secondary teachers. This is Professional Development Webinar 1, Why We Prioritize Standards. I'm assuming that all of us will watch this first webinar, and you'll see as we go through today, this first piece. This will be specific to everyone in terms of the overall information, and then we'll get into some more specific detailed examples with different disciplines, different subject matters about how we will prioritize the standards within our subject matter. So I want to begin right away. A little bit about me. Very honored and excited to have a chance to engage in this conversation with everyone. I've been in education now coming up on 19th year, and I've specifically spent that at the secondary level as a practitioner, first as a biology teacher, and then as an administrator in a large district in Indiana. For 2 years, I was an administrator of a middle school that was about 1,250 students. Then the final part of my administrative career was a very large high school. It was 3,400 students just in grades 10, 11, and 12. But what I want to share and stress upon the group is my work in terms of presenting and consulting this work now for over 12 years, and a lot of Larry Ainsworth's common formative assessment model is work that I was able to engage in first as a teacher, but then as an administrator and also as a school administrator, but then also overseeing it from a district level. The importance of prioritizing standards to develop quality common formative assessments that we can use to garner information about student understanding. And I've recently published my first book through Corwin, which focuses not on statistical elements related to grading, but what are some very practical, authentic examples of how secondary teachers, which all teachers have a different challenge at some levels. In some ways, we're not as unique at the secondary levels as our elementary colleagues, but there are some things that are specific to our subject matter, specifically our subject matter, but also the content that we teach and also the structure in which we teach. And so it really focuses on the lens of what does it mean to be a secondary practitioner. One of the struggles all of us face as classroom teachers is our desire to make sure we can teach it all and teach it well with limited time. And what I was stressing a moment ago in the previous slide was that we have at the secondary level sometimes a little bit more time constraints. Most high schools are going to have an 18-week semester, or sometimes we have a system where we're going to keep the same students, but we have credits and courses that will have a structured time frame, and how we can teach it well within that time frame, which is a basis for the rationale for prioritizing standards. Hopefully you also have in front of you the working handout. For today's session, the working handout will align with this first webinar, Why We Prioritize Standards, but then webinar 1A, 1B, or 1C that aligns specifically with ELA, math, or science. And then also Judy's document that you might have in front of you if you had a chance to take a look at the initial work that's been done in Fremont, the preliminary work on how we're going to prioritize standards. So all those pieces of resources which you can use throughout this process to gain more information, and then as we go forward, how we'll guide it into the work that'll be done at the subject matter level, the PLC level. And so it's a collaborative model that's done with a construct that will all follow in Fremont, but allows them the right amount of autonomy at the different subject matters within the same construct, so we're all focusing from the same lens, from the same filters, which I'm going to walk us through here today. For each one of our sessions, we'll talk about success criteria. By the end of this webinar, meaning this one and then your specific subject matter one, what is the critical rationale for developing a solid list of prioritized standards for your course, your department? Be able to apply the 4 critical elements used in developing a solid list of prioritized standards. Those are really the focus for this webinar. When you go into the next one, which will be specific to your subject matter, that's when we begin to develop a list of prioritized standards for your specific teaching or subject matter for the several units forthcoming this school year. We aren't abandoning social studies or history. We're going to include that in a later webinar when we tie it in with a shared language of learning around literacy standards. So history teachers, please know that your specific information is going to be included in that webinar in terms of your subject matter. So why do we need to prioritize standards? I'm going to walk us first through the practical lens, and I want us to think about when we first started teaching, when we first discovered this, when we realized we weren't going to teach it all. My first day as a biology teacher, Jim Baumgartner, who was my department chair, handed me a textbook and literally said, chapter 47 is the record. Now, I don't know if he said 47, but he said something very similar to that, as if covering or getting through as many chapters of content was the goal, as opposed to making sure teachers or making sure students are learning it well. And I want us to think as science or English or math or whatever our subject matter is. As we're teaching this year, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that the most important thing that will impact our success anytime in our classroom in our teaching is how well our peers taught and assessed the year before of the essential content. So right now, if you think about the students that you're going to have at the start of next semester, if they're going to come from another teacher or next school year, what would you say you would want those teachers to have taught well? What does that list look like? And I'm willing to bet it starts with this word, just. They could just really understand the concept of lift and understand some basics around some of the science content and processes. In math or language arts, what are some of those just that students really need to be successful? That's how our priority standards really come to life. And so I think we can look at it from that lens as to why we really want some of these essentials to be the focus, not just for my classroom, but how it builds for the other colleagues that are within my department or my course team. James Popham has long supported this call for prioritization. James Popham, professor emeritus at UCLA, literally the world's leading expert on assessment. And he says that teachers need to prioritize a set of content standards so they can identify the content standards at which they will devote powerful, thoughtful, and ongoing instruction that they need to formally and systematically assess student mastery of only those high priority content standards. So what we focus on the most, certainly we're going to teach more than this. We're going to grade more than this. But what are the things that we're going to teach really, really well that are the just, not just in my biology classroom, but then build towards chemistry and physics, not just in my English 9 classroom, that build what my colleagues are going to teach in grades 10, 11, and 12. And we're doing that so as we build quality, formative, and common formative assessments, we can remember that any assessment really comes down to 3 critical points. What is my purpose? So my priority standard, the essentials of that unit, what am I really focusing on? And when do I gather enough evidence to make an accurate inference? And that's where once we have our standards prioritized, we can make sure that not only our instruction, but the assessment tools we use with students are really focused on gathering the information around those essentials. And I think we all know this is easier said than done. But this was a driving force in many of the districts I've worked in, not only as an administrator, but as a classroom teacher. It was critical that if we didn't think first what our purpose was, but that essential standard, it's possible that we could be assessing students on things that really weren't the essentials of what we were teaching and what was really most important. When we talk about how this builds towards common formative assessments, the key first is that there's a quality formative part. Certainly we'll talk about the nature and need to have a common element where we're collaboratively designing these and making sure that we're assessing these and collaboratively scoring. But there are pre and post assessments within units that they're administered to students throughout the year that focus on the priority concepts and skills students need to develop mastery around for success in that current and subsequent course of study. What are those things conceptually that we'll need to build from unit to unit in language arts or science? And then at times we're going to get deeper into some of the vocabulary and content, and that's the priority of that unit. That's what drives a quality common formative assessment. So that way they can assess student learning within that current unit of study and provide teachers the ability to determine what do students currently know, what is essential that they still need to learn and demonstrate mastery, and then what is essential for that particular unit in terms of my learning intentions. And again, this is really a driving force for why we need to prioritize standards so we don't misuse some of our content at times. We can still use our units on To Kill a Mockingbird and some of our science labs and some of our math units, but making sure that we're assessing the essentials more heavily and going back and reteaching those within that unit, maybe with more intentionality. And so what we're talking about is with all the standards we have to teach and all the assessments that we use, our priority standards will help us develop a focus for that unit. And going back to my point about To Kill a Mockingbird, we're really not teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. We're teaching about complex characters or citing specific evidence within the text, and we're going to use that tool, that novel, which is just one example, to do that. So this might help us better use our existing curriculum and focus our attention on what we're garnering from students in terms of what they know that's essential. And again, this sounds simple in nature, but this is why if we have a construct for that, we will do it in every discipline, in every course team in Fremont. Then within the different subject matters, we can go in deeper because we have different content elements that we will apply. Again, carefully selected subset of that total list of standards that students need to develop an acceptable level of mastery to be prepared for the next level of course. That's what a priority standard is. They're a subset of our total list of standards, and they will represent the assured competencies. So when you think about when students are coming into our courses, I started a moment ago or a few slides back with the just. What are those things that when they walk into my class and they've had a reasonable grade or they're coming from biology to chemistry or English 9 to 10, What are those assured competencies we should expect students demonstrate proficiency in? And that's where our priority standards are developed and defined from. And as you will see in your handout, the definitions to the 4 criteria for priority standard selection. The first thing is they have endurance. They will stand the test of time. One of the terms that the Common Core standards, Common Core author developers added into the language arts standards was the term argument. When you think about how important that term argument is, students will argue in language arts, but they will argue in science as to what the strongest variable was. They will argue in social studies in terms of who really was the main perpetrator of a war, what was the main element that caused the war to take off. In math, they are forming an argument how the best way to solve a problem is. So when we talk about endurance, what are those concepts and skills embedded in the standards that we know are going to stand the test of time? Readiness is where our subject matter people really need to come together. What do students really need to be ready for when they move from Algebra 1 to Algebra 2, or Algebra to Geometry, or they're moving throughout our courses in social studies or science? What are those embedded skills and concepts that students really need to have to be successful from one course to the next? And then leverage. And this is an opportunity at the secondary level, and we think about what we put our students through every day, and they have 6 or 7 courses that they're going to with different teachers, different subject matter. What are places that we can look for making connections from one subject matter to the other? Our final criteria is, what is our external exam? Now, what we mean by that is not teaching to the test, but making sure that if there's a format or a type of assessment model that takes place, for example, on SBAC, that we want to consider that. And it's not that we're teaching to the test. We want to prepare our students for that assessment that they're going to be taking so that nothing gets in the way of the assessment design or what's more heavily assessed on certain assessments or with next generation science assessments as they are developed and put in front of us. That is a filter. Notice I introduced it last. It's not unimportant, but it doesn't come until after we have those other 3 pieces in place. So our chance for our first reflection question. How do you personally, as a teacher, and if you're working in a group, this is a perfect time to pause the recording as long as you would need, complete the reflection question, and maybe have a bit of dialogue around it. But how do you currently apply the filters for priority standards when determining what is essential to teach, and assess well and ensure students are developing mastery? Please pause the recording as long as you need. I'll pause momentarily and then move on. I'll assume you'll pause as long as you need to complete the reflection, and if you're in a group, have a dialogue about that specific question. Back in just a moment. Thanks so much. Again, as we go throughout the webinar, this webinar series, whenever there's a reflection question, please take time to pause the recording. As long as you need to, I will move on to keep the length of the webinar as short and concise as possible. Another small piece that I'm just going to introduce now that we're going to come back to later is we're developing possibly our list over time of what are approved and agreed upon priority standards. We'll talk about the accordion model. What we mean by this is when we play an accordion, it never completely touches, but it never gets too far apart. So as we're designing, now that we know our filters for that, certain grade levels or certain course teams can develop their list, come back together, see if it fits, go back and work, come back together. And one of those future webinars will specifically highlight that. But the vertical design and alignment is critical. So when we're putting teachers together and they're determining, what do I think my priority is, my peers, and then coming back and having that deep discourse at this level where there's high levels of teacher voice, there's high levels of positive interdependence as to how we're deciding our filters for priority standards. And then this is just an example in districts I've worked in where we literally put them on the wall and we look for that alignment. And we look for places, is there gaps, for example, between English 9, 10, and 11? Are there gaps in what we're determining priorities between algebra, algebra 2, geometry, so on and so forth? So another chance to have a reflection question here. How does your current teaching team, your course team, your department, your PLC determine what standards are truly essential for students to master, and how is that possibly developed vertically? Again, we're going to go into this at a deeper level on a future webinar in this series, but take a moment and reflect on this question, pause as long as you need. If you're in a group, dialogue as long as you would need to, and then come back together. I'll pause momentarily and then bring us back. Excellent. Thanks so much. Again, as always, I will pause momentarily, give you a chance to pause the recording. Please pause as long as you need to. The final piece in this opening webinar that we want to talk about is supporting standards. And the way to think about supporting standards, the metaphor that Larry Ainsworth uses, is a fence. The priorities are the posts. The supporting standards are the rails. If our post falls down, the fence in a sense falls down. But you can't have a fence without rails. But you could lose a rail here or there. So I will have supporting standards within my unit that will be taught through the context of the priorities. They do not receive the same degree of instruction and assessment emphasis, which means we don't spend as much time on those. If I am really focusing on how my students are citing textual evidence, certainly they're going to have to write it to me. Certainly they might even speaking it to me, or they're speaking in listening standards as examples as the supporting standards. But I'm focusing less of my instruction and my assessment on my supporting standards. And again, they become the scaffolds that help students attain more understanding related to the rigorous and comprehensive priority standards that will scaffold from one unit to the next. I want to show you just one example here of how possibly your units could be determined, because we might have a priority standard, for example, 7.1, that is a priority in multiple units. Priority standards would rarely, if ever, only be taught once. But then that same standard is addressed to some degree in other standards. When we have our map out like this, then we know, and many times teachers struggle with, when should I move on or when should I stay put? There's two factors that can drive that. The first one is what type of learning is that standard and that instruction based around? Is it conceptual learning? Because if it is conceptual learning, sort of the concept, as I mentioned before, of LIPT, or some of the concepts that happen in science or social studies or English, we never get those in one time. If it's procedural knowledge, like understanding how to design or how to understand how the periodic table has been designed, that's something procedural that once I have that, I can kind of move on, and I don't really need to be retaught that very often, and it might be something essential that I stay put. The other thing that will drive a decision for a busy teacher, and I understand the frustration, I hear it all the time, and I don't have the best or perfect answer, but when do I move on? Well, if I know that there's a standard, for example, like 7.4, and as much as that's embedded in my first unit, I know I've got a chance in one of the subsequent units to hit it again at a deep level, I'm less inclined to maybe perseverate over if there's enough understanding to move on, or if most of the students are getting it. We also could have a standard like 7.10 or 9.10. The 10th standard is always reading on grade level. Well, when that happens, that standard is always going to be a supporting standard for every unit. By default, then it kind of has become a priority standard, and I'm always addressing it, but I'm never completely addressing it to the point that I would have to stop teaching and reteach before I would move on. We will show some of the same kinds of examples in science or English or other subject, or science or history or math. But this is just a model that I wanted everyone to see, as you can look at where we might determine when certain standards are priorities, and then when those priorities might come back again as a supporting standard. Our final reflection question for this opening webinar: how does looking at priority standards in some units as being addressed as supporting standards in others, what does that make you think about? Take a moment, again, pause the recording as long as you need, complete the reflection question. We'll be back in just a moment. I'll continue on, but please pause as long as you need, individually or your group, to look at how we might consider this concept of priority standards that sometimes serve as supporting standards in certain units. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. As always, I'll say this many times, sounds a little bit like a broken record, but it's intentional. If you need to pause the recording, please do so. If you need to move on, I'll assume that you're taking care of whatever learning needs you need. So the final question is, why haven't the standards already been prioritized for us? Well, there are several reasons for that. And the first one is that with all of the things that we could teach, it's essential for schools and districts and departments to look at what is our consistent set of practices from one grade level to the next, one course level to the next. Because when we are focused on how we are teaching and assessing standards and making the right instructional adjustments based on those, achievement learning is going to increase and going to go up. And where your students come in and their level of understanding is going to, drive sometimes when we make slight adjustments in what are our priorities from one year to the next. So again, we'll address this in detail as we go through the multiple units, but it's a fair question. But what's essential is that when a department, a district like Fremont, the departments within Fremont at the secondary level, are really making sure that when students go through their course of study in science, this is our focus for these pieces. Not only is learning going to go deeper with students, we're going to have a better chance to share resources and ideas from teacher to teacher, and the adults are going to have a better chance to learn more from each other and how we are focusing on certain concepts and skills at a deeper level. We will always end with our success criteria. So as I mentioned before, this first set of webinars, which includes this one and then your specific content one, by the end of this, you should be able to complete the first 2 points here. This third one, developing a list of prioritized standards, hopefully you've started thinking about that, and that will be forthcoming in the next webinar, whether it's English, math, or science. As I mentioned, the social studies and history standards, those are embedded on the one related to a shared language of literacy. Anytime you have questions throughout this webinar series, please shoot me an email at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. Anytime, I'd be more than happy to engage in a deeper dialogue with you or address your question at the best level I possibly can. I've also included here on this last slide my cell phone number. I've actually had some dialogue already with some folks who had emailed and said, could we talk about this? Please feel free. There's my Twitter handle. And of course, Corwin.com is an excellent resource for more information on priority standards and developing quality common formative assessments. Thank you so much for listening and look forward to talking with you on the next webinar.